In the year 2026, archaeologists digging at Karnak uncovered something that should not exist. A stone slab, 2,000 years old, showing a Roman emperor wearing the double crown of Egypt. Not a king who conquered Egypt, a king who became Egypt. For 300 years, the rulers of Rome did something almost nobody talks about today. They put on the mask of the pharaohs, walked into the oldest temples on earth, and let Egyptian priests crown them as living gods. Why would the most powerful empire in the world need to borrow the religion of the people it had just defeated? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Rome stole the soul of a civilization and why one of those emperors ended up erasing his own brother from the wall of a sacred temple. Before we continue, a quick word. We are a small, independent channel, and every single subscriber genuinely matters to us. If you enjoy this kind of deep, evidence-based history, please consider subscribing. We have no sponsors, so your support is truly what keeps this channel alive. A like, a comment, or sharing this video with someone who loves history helps more than you know. Thank you sincerely for being here with us. The Conquest. In 31 before Christ, the combined fleets of Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, were crushed at the Battle of Actium by the forces of Octavian. Within a year, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead, and Octavian, soon to be renamed Augustus by the Roman Senate, stood as the sole master of Egypt. 3,000 years of pharaonic rule, stretching back to the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 before Christ, came to an end in a single military campaign. But Augustus did something almost nobody else in Roman history attempted. He refused to treat Egypt like any other conquered territory. Normally, a new Roman province would be governed by a senator, appointed by the Senate, answerable in some form to Roman political tradition. Egypt was different. Augustus declared it his own personal property, what historians call the Patrimonium Caesaris, the patrimony of Caesar. He placed a single prefect, a man of equestrian rank rather than senatorial rank, in direct charge of the province, answerable only to himself. Senators were formally forbidden from even visiting Egypt without the emperor's personal written permission. Why such extraordinary paranoia over one territory? The answer lies beneath the sand, in the black soil of the Nile Valley. Egypt was, quite simply, the breadbasket of the entire Roman world. The grain harvested along the Nile filled the holds of massive grain fleets bound for Rome, feeding the Annona, the grain dole that kept hundreds of thousands of poor Roman citizens from starvation. A disruption in that grain supply meant riots in the streets of the capital itself. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled whether Rome's poor ate or starved, and whoever controlled that leverage controlled Rome's political stability. But feeding the city was only half the equation. Augustus quickly understood that grain alone could not guarantee loyalty from a population whose entire worldview rested on something far older and far stranger than economics, a religious system 3,000 years old, one that demanded its ruler be something more than a man. To truly secure Egypt, Augustus realized he needed to become a god. Augustus, the first Roman pharaoh. At the Temple of Dendur, a small but exquisitely preserved sandstone temple that today stands remarkably inside the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, Augustus appears carved into the stone wearing full Egyptian royal dress, the shendit kilt, the Nemes headcloth, and the regalia of a pharaoh performing offerings to the goddess Isis and her son Horus. Beside his image, hieroglyphic cartouches, the oval rings that traditionally enclose the pharaoh's sacred names, read simply Pharaoh. Other cartouches nearby translate his Roman imperial titles directly into the language of the pharaohs: autocrator, the Greek word for emperor, and kaiseros, the Greek rendering of Caesar. This was never mere decoration or flattery. In ancient Egyptian theology, the pharaoh occupied a unique and irreplaceable position in the structure of the universe. He was not simply a political ruler, He was considered the living guarantor of Ma'at, the fundamental principle of cosmic order, truth, and balance that the Egyptians believed held chaos at bay. Egyptian temples functioned, in theory, as the residences of the gods themselves, and the daily rituals performed within them, the offerings of food, incense, and sacred water, were rituals that only the pharaoh, as the god's chosen intermediary, was theologically permitted to perform. In practice, ordinary priests carried out these rituals on the pharaoh's behalf. But the king's image, name, and symbolic presence had to be carved into the temple walls for the rituals to carry their full religious weight. Without a pharaoh, in Egyptian belief, the entire machinery connecting humanity to the gods would grind to a halt, and chaos would flood back into the world. Augustus understood this completely. By allowing himself to be depicted as pharaoh at Dendur and at other temples across Egypt, he gave the Egyptian priesthood precisely what their religious system required: a king who looked, in carved stone, exactly like a king should, even though the man himself likely never set foot inside many of these temples during his entire reign. The Tiberius discovery. Now here is where this story becomes personal and remarkably current. In the spring of 2026, a joint Egyptian and French archaeological team working under the Centre Franco-Egyptien d'études des Temples de Karnak was restoring the ancient gate built by Pharaoh Ramesses III, located at the northern edge of the Karnak temple complex in Luxor. During that restoration, the team uncovered a sandstone stela, a freestanding inscribed stone slab that had lain buried for roughly 2,000 years. The stela, measuring about 60 centimeters in length and 40 centimeters in width, shows the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 after Christ, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the very crown that symbolized the unification of the two ancient kingdoms. He stands in a traditional pose of offering before the Theban Triad, the most sacred family of gods worshipped at Karnak, Amun-Ra, the supreme god and king of the gods, his wife Mut, the mother goddess, and their son Khonsu, the god of the moon. Below this carved scene, 5 horizontal lines of hieroglyphic text record the restoration of a protective wall belonging to the temple of Amun-Ra, work apparently carried out, symbolically at least, under Tiberius's authority. According to Dr. Abdelgafar Wagdi, Director General of Luxor Antiquities and head of the Egyptian side of the excavation, this image was almost certainly never meant to record an actual personal visit by Tiberius to the site. The emperor likely never set eyes on this particular stretch of wall in his entire life. As Wagdi explained to the press following the discovery, the ruler needed to be shown performing traditional rituals in a form that the gods themselves would recognize, namely as a pharaoh. The monument, in his words, expresses what a king should be in purely Egyptian religious terms, rather than documenting where the actual man, the actual emperor sitting in Rome, ever physically stood. This single detail reframes almost everything we think we know about these so-called Roman pharaohs. They were not, for the most part, men who traveled to Egypt, donned ceremonial robes, and personally performed rituals before the gods. They were instead symbolic placeholders, images carved by Egyptian artisans according to Egyptian theological requirements, often without the emperor in Rome having any direct involvement at all in the design. That raises an unsettling question we will return to before this video ends. If these emperors rarely, if ever, appeared in person, who in Egypt was truly in control of the story being permanently carved into stone? The Roman emperor in his palace far away, or the Egyptian priesthood who actually held the chisels? Claudius, the reluctant god king. The emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 after Christ and is remembered in Roman history largely for his physical disabilities and his unexpected rise to power following the assassination of his nephew Caligula, also appears repeatedly in Egyptian temple art wearing the full regalia of a pharaoh. His patronage is documented at Aswan, at Athribis, at the temple of Esna, at Kom Ombo, and at the sacred island sanctuary of Philae. In one notable relief, likely from the reign of Claudius or possibly his successor Nero, since the surviving hieroglyphic strip identifying the figure is only partially preserved. An emperor of the Claudian line is shown undergoing what scholars call the baptism of Pharaoh, a purification ritual that formed part of traditional Egyptian coronation ceremonies. In the carving, the god Thoth, depicted with the head of an ibis, pours streams of water, rendered as the hieroglyphic symbols for life and dominion, over the head of the kneeling emperor. The god Horus would originally have performed the same ritual on the opposite side, though that portion of the relief has not survived. Other inscriptions from temples across Egypt give Claudius hieroglyphic titles, identifying him as Son of Ra, Lord of the Crowns, and king of both Upper and Lower Egypt, the exact same sacred titulary that had been used to describe pharaohs for 3,000 years before a single Roman soldier ever set foot in Egypt. Nero, the tyrant crowned as a god. Nero, perhaps the most infamous of all Roman emperors, a man Roman historians blamed for matricide, for persecuting early Christians, and for allegedly fiddling while Rome burned, also wore the crown of the pharaohs in Egyptian religious art. At the Temple of Isis on the sacred island of Philae, near modern Aswan, Nero is shown as pharaoh, presenting the two ujatais, ancient symbols representing Upper and Lower Egypt, to the gods Horus and Isis. Egyptian scribes composed for him a full royal titulary in hieroglyphs, an elaborate sequence of names translating roughly as Emperor Nero, ruler of rulers, chosen by Ptah, beloved of Isis, the sturdy armed one who struck the foreign lands, victorious for Egypt. The man that Roman historians remember as a paranoid, murderous tyrant, Egyptian priests carved into eternal stone as a divinely chosen, victorious god-king. Nero is also recorded sponsoring Egyptian elites at the Dakhla oasis deep in the western desert, as well as at Karanis, Akoris, Aswan, and Kom Ombo, suggesting his administration maintained an active religious and political presence across the province, even if the emperor himself never personally traveled there. The Flavians, stability after chaos.
Following Nero's death in 68 after Christ, Rome plunged into a brutal civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Remarkably, even amid that chaos, the Egyptian religious tradition continued uninterrupted. Images of both the short-lived emperors Otho and Galba were carved into reliefs at Medinet Habu, an ancient pharaonic temple originally built more than 1,000 years earlier during the 18th dynasty. No equivalent monument to the Emperor Vitellius, who held power only briefly, has ever been found, perhaps simply a reflection of how short and chaotic his reign truly was.
Stability finally returned under the Flavian dynasty, founded by Vespasian and continued by his sons Titus and Domitian. All three Flavian emperors are recorded as having sponsored religious construction work at the Temple of Esna. Domitian in particular appears in a striking relief at Kom Ombo, shown alongside multiple Egyptian deities, paying solemn homage to the temple's central triad of gods, Sobek, the crocodile god, Hathor, and their divine son Khonsu. Trajan and the kiosk at Philae. Few Roman additions to the Egyptian religious landscape are more photographed today than the kiosk of Trajan, an elegant, open-sided pavilion of 14 massive columns, standing on the sacred island of Philae. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 after Christ and presided over the Roman Empire at its greatest territorial extent, is depicted within reliefs there, making offerings to the gods Isis and Osiris, continuing a tradition by then already more than a century old. Trajan also commissioned work at the Temple of Dendera and is recorded as a patron at the Temple of Hathor's broader complex, where Roman period kiosks and gateways, including a gateway attributed jointly to Domitian and Trajan, were added to the mud brick enclosure wall surrounding the sanctuary. By Trajan's reign, the pattern was firmly established. Each new emperor, regardless of his personal religious beliefs back in Rome, was expected to maintain the ancient fiction that Egypt still had a living pharaoh. Hadrian, grief, and the birth of a new god. No emperor's relationship with Egypt was stranger, or more emotionally complex than that of Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 after Christ. In the year 130, while touring Egypt with his imperial court, Hadrian's young companion Antinos drowned in the Nile River under circumstances that ancient sources describe only vaguely, some suggesting accident, others hinting at ritual sacrifice, others suspecting deliberate self-sacrifice on Antinos's part to avert misfortune predicted for the emperor. Whatever the true circumstances, Hadrian's reaction was extraordinary. He founded an entirely new Egyptian city, Antinopolis, on the very riverbank where the young man had died, and declared Antinos a god, merged in religious identity with the ancient Egyptian deity Osiris, becoming Osiris Antinos. Temples, statues, and entire religious cults dedicated to this new god spread rapidly across the Roman world, from Egypt itself to Greece and Italy. Historians remain divided on how to interpret this. Was it the genuine, overwhelming grief of a powerful man who had lost someone he deeply loved, expressed through the only language of permanence Rome and Egypt both understood, the language of divine cult and monumental architecture? Or was it calculated political theater, an opportunity to weave Hadrian's personal tragedy into Egyptian religious tradition, reinforcing his own legitimacy as the protector and patron of Egypt's gods? The evidence supports elements of both interpretations, and the debate continues among scholars to this day. The sacred circuit, Dendera, Edfu, Komombo, and Esna, four temples along the Nile, Dendera, Edfu, Komombo, and Esna, are recognized together today by UNESCO under the title Pharaonic Temples of the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. Together they form what we might call the sacred circuit, the clearest surviving visual record of how this strange relationship between Roman power and Egyptian religion evolved and ultimately decayed over nearly 3 centuries. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera was finally completed under Tiberius, an astonishing 185 years after construction had originally begun under the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt's Greek-speaking rulers before Rome's arrival. The same slow, multi-generational pattern of construction applied to Esna, Komombo, and Philae as well, each site built up gradually across centuries under Ptolemaic kings and then Roman emperors alike, almost as if the gods themselves were indifferent to which foreign dynasty happened to be paying for the stonework. At Komombo, an unusual double temple dedicated simultaneously to 2 separate divine families, the crocodile god Sobek and the falcon god Horus the Elder, Tiberius personally funded construction of the temple's great courtyard, featuring 16 painted columns arranged along 3 sides. At Edfu, the Temple of Horus stands today as one of the best preserved temples anywhere in Egypt, its construction having begun under the Ptolemies and its decoration continuing well into the Roman period. But examining the later Roman period carvings closely and something begins to change. Across multiple sites, cartouches, the sacred oval frames meant to hold an emperor's official name were left completely empty by the artisans, never finished, never filled in. Sacred ritual symbols, including the sistrum, a rattle-like instrument closely associated with the goddess Hathor, were left mutilated or incomplete in several later reliefs. Rome's commitment to maintaining the elaborate fiction of pharaonic kingship was, quite visibly, slowly fading, and you can see that fading written directly into the unfinished stone itself. Isis conquers the empire. While Roman emperors were busy adopting Egyptian religious imagery for political purposes, something remarkable was happening in the opposite direction. Egyptian religion itself, particularly the cult of the goddess Isis, was spreading rapidly across the entire Roman world. By the 1st century after Christ, temples dedicated to Isis could be found from Londinium, the Roman settlement that would eventually become London, all the way east to the banks of the Euphrates River. This was not simple religious tolerance. It was administrative pragmatism of the highest order. Roman authorities recognized that the Egyptian priesthood held enormous influence over the local population, controlling not just religious life, but significant economic and social structures as well. By funding temple repairs, by allowing emperors to be depicted as pharaohs, and by permitting Egyptian cults to spread freely throughout the empire, Roman administrators effectively purchased the cooperation of Egypt's religious establishment without ever needing to station a massive, costly standing army throughout the province to maintain control by force alone. The Severans, and a brother erased from history. In the years 199 and 200 after Christ, the Emperor Septimius Severus toured Egypt, accompanied by his entire family, his wife Julia Domna, who held the formal title of Augusta, and his two sons, Caracalla and Geta, both recognized as co-rulers. A relief carved at the Temple of Esna during this visit shows all four family members together, a rare and deliberately staged portrait of imperial family unity. That unity did not last. After their father's death, Caracalla and Geta were meant to rule jointly as co-emperors, but the arrangement collapsed almost immediately into open hostility. In the year 211, Caracalla had his own brother murdered, reportedly in their mother's presence, to seize sole control of the empire. What followed was a formal daemetio memoria, a deliberate Roman practice of erasing a condemned individual completely from the historical and visual record, removing his name from inscriptions, his face from statues, his very existence from official memory. And this erasure was carried out not only in Rome, but on the sacred wall of the Temple of Esna itself. Geta's carved image was deliberately chiseled away from that same family relief, leaving a visible scar in the stone where a young co-emperor's face once stood. Think about what that means. The very monument meant to guarantee cosmic order, meant to express eternal divine kingship according to a religious tradition 3,000 years old, had become, quite literally, a weapon of political murder and erasure. Caracalla's own titles continued to be recorded afterward at Philae, at Ombos, and across sites in Middle Egypt and the Delta region, proof that despite the brutal manner of his rise, the old machinery of pharaonic propaganda continued operating exactly as before. Caracalla's eventual successor Macrinus left evidence of his own patronage only at Com Ombo. Of his successor after that, Elagabalus, no record survives in Egypt at all. And of Severus Alexander, who followed him, nothing has been documented either. By the early 3rd century after Christ, massive temple building and decoration dedicated to the Egyptian gods had essentially ceased altogether across the province. The final sunset. The ancient tradition did not end all at once. It faded, slowly in fragments. Under the Emperor Philip the Arab, who ruled in the mid-3rd century, the last confirmed Roman period inscription was added to the Temple of Calabsha, near Aswan. Sometime after his reign, Roman administrators effectively abandoned active religious patronage at that site entirely. Afterward, at the Temple of Esna, Philip the Arab's cartouche was carved onto the temple wall, following the ancient 3,000-year-old custom. Then, in an almost poetic final act, his successor Decius had his own cartouche carved directly over Philip's, the very last documented example of a practice as old as Egyptian civilization itself, a new king symbolically overwriting the legacy of the one who came before him. Soon afterward, a different religious movement, one that had already been quietly spreading through Egypt and across the wider Roman world for 2 centuries, Christianity, began to rise toward dominance. The age of the god-kings, both Egyptian and Roman, the age in which a Roman emperor sitting in a palace thousands of miles away could be carved into sacred stone as a living, breathing god of the Nile, was finally irreversibly drawing to a close. Preservation, or thephis. So how should we ultimately judge what happened here? Historians remain genuinely divided into 2 competing schools of thought. The preservationist school argues that Roman patronage, the temple construction, the canal dredging, The continuous religious funding across nearly 3 centuries actually saved a dying civilization from complete and total collapse, extending the life of Egyptian religious tradition far longer than it might otherwise have survived under purely Egyptian rule alone. The appropriationist school argues something far darker, that Rome systematically hollowed out the original spiritual content of Egyptian religion, transforming it into pure political theater, a calculated performance designed for one purpose only: keeping the grain flowing toward Rome and keeping the local population docile and unrebellious. The modern academic consensus increasingly favors a more complicated middle position, a genuine hybridity between these two extremes. While Roman emperors undeniably appropriated pharaonic iconography for purposes of political control, the native Egyptian priesthood themselves were never simply passive victims in this story. Egyptian priests actively participated in packaging each new Roman ruler as a legitimate pharaoh, deliberately, strategically, in order to ensure their own temples, their own traditions, and their own religious authority continued surviving within this strange new imperial world order. What the Romans themselves wrote:
Everything we have described so far comes from stone and excavation. But Rome also left behind something just as valuable: the actual words of the men who lived through this transformation, written in their own hand.
The Greek geographer Strabo personally sailed up the Nile as far as the island of Philae around 25 before Christ, traveling alongside Aelius Gallus, one of Egypt's first Roman prefects. In his geography, Strabo describes Egypt under Roman rule directly, noting that the province paid considerable tribute and was, in his words, governed by prudent men sent there in succession. Strabo was no neutral observer. He openly criticized the final Ptolemaic rulers as corrupt, while praising the economic order the Roman prefects imposed, a clear example of pro-Roman propaganda being written into history in real time by a man who had personally witnessed both worlds. The historian Cassius Dio, writing more than 2 centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, recorded something remarkable: a speech he attributed to Augustus, delivered to Roman troops just before the Battle of Actium. In it, Augustus reportedly mocked Mark Antony's soldiers for serving as bodyguards to an Egyptian queen, framing Antony as having abandoned Roman tradition entirely for what Dio's account calls an effeminate, foreign way of life. Whether or not Augustus delivered these exact words, the speech reveals something crucial. Before Augustus ever wore the crown of a pharaoh himself, Roman propaganda had spent years portraying Egyptian customs as dangerous and corrupting. The same civilization Augustus would later dress himself in religiously as pharaoh had first been painted by his own propaganda machine as a threat to Roman manhood itself. Perhaps the most vivid primary account comes from the historian Tacitus, describing an event nearly 50 years after Augustus's conquest. In the year 19 after Christ, Germanicus, the popular and celebrated nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, traveled to Egypt. Tacitus tells us this was technically forbidden, since Augustus had decreed that no senator or high-ranking noble could enter Egypt without the emperor's direct personal permission, precisely to prevent anyone from using Egypt's wealth and isolation to seize power and to protect Italy's grain supply from being cut off. Germanicus went anyway, officially, to study Egypt's ancient monuments. Tacitus describes him sailing up the Nile, visiting the vast ruins of ancient Thebes, where massive inscriptions still stood describing the city's lost former grandeur. Germanicus walked among monuments already 1,000 years old in his own time, reading hieroglyphic records of pharaohs who had ruled and vanished long before Rome itself existed. According to Tacitus, Tiberius was furious. Germanicus' unauthorized journey into Egypt, more than almost anything else he did, is described by historians as a contributing factor in the growing suspicion and hostility between the emperor and his popular nephew. Germanicus died suddenly the following year in Syria, under circumstances many Romans at the time believed were not natural. Think about the parallel here. An ambitious young Roman who wandered too freely among Egypt's ancient symbols of kingship met a sudden suspicious end. 2 centuries later, a Roman co-emperor's face would be chiseled off a temple wall in Esna for daring to share power he was never meant to share. Egypt's old religion of god-kings seemed to carry warnings written into its very stones, warnings about ambition, about power, and about what happens to those who reach for too much of it. So why did Rome really do all of this? Not from simple admiration of Egyptian culture alone, and not from pure cynical greed either. It was, above everything else, a matter of survival for both sides. Egypt's grain kept Rome fed and politically stable. Egypt's priesthood, in turn, kept Egypt's population obedient and its ancient traditions alive. By becoming pharaoh, even if only in carved image, even if the man himself often never set foot in the temple bearing his name, Roman emperors purchased centuries of peace, stability, and the continued loyalty of one of history's oldest civilizations, all without needing a single additional soldier garrisoned along the Nile. Whether you choose to see this as preservation or as the theft of a sacred identity, the stones along the Nile River still hold the answer today, carved permanently by the very priests who lived through every single moment of that long, complicated transformation. If you found this story as fascinating as we did researching it, please subscribe to the channel. We are small and independent, and we genuinely rely on viewers exactly like you, since we work without any sponsorship at all. A like, a comment telling us what surprised you most, and sharing this video with a friend who loves ancient history would mean the absolute world to us. Thank you truly and sincerely for watching all the way until the end.